Deep Sea Embers Chapter 396 to 400. Duncan had indeed managed to create a spark in that mirror frost, but he was plagued with a nagging sensation that this was insufficient. His experiences with frost starkly contrasted those with planned. The spark he had tossed into the mirrored world hadn't multiplied as rapidly as he had expected. Furthermore, his sense of the spark's existence seemed significantly less potent and was riddled with intermittent disturbances. Duncan speculated the cause might be a naturally occurring barricade between both sides, or perhaps, the mirror image wasn't a perfect replication of the real world. The discrepancies between the two could be acting as a sort of static interference, obstructing his cognitive abilities. Regardless of the root cause, it was evident that Duncan had to find a method to augment his bond with the spark and fortify his connection with both the White Oak and Agatha. As they continued their conversation, Vanna suddenly adopted a thoughtful expression, posing a question. "You're absolutely certain that you saw the gatekeeper's reflection in the glass?" Duncan affirmed, without a doubt. This perplexed Vanna, prompting her to furrow her brows. "That's bizarre. If she is indeed confined within that mirror dimension, wouldn't there have been some sort of reaction from the city-state by now? Even if the news of the Supreme Protector's unexplained disappearance were concealed to prevent panic, the Death Church and City Hall would have undertaken some countermeasures." She paused momentarily before offering a theory derived from her own experiences: secretive investigations, imposition of martial law in specific areas, or alterations to the routine and distribution of the Guardian's nocturnal patrols. Even with a news blackout, these shifts are noticeable to an external observer. However, Mr. Morris and I were extensively active within the city-state today and observed no such changes. Upon hearing this, Nina, who had been engrossed in a book, lifted her gaze and offered her own hypothesis: perhaps the gatekeeper's disappearance was recent, and the city-state simply hasn't had time to respond. Vanna shook her head solemnly at this possibility. If that were true, it would indicate Frost is utterly beyond help. However, based on my observations recently, despite its decline, the city-state seems to be managing fairly well in other aspects. The Death Church and City Hall appear to function smoothly. Maybe we'll see the city-state's response tomorrow, Duncan suggested casually. However, before he could expand further on his idea, a somewhat substantial pressure on his arm halted his speech. It appeared that Shirley had dozed off, her head having found a resting place on his arm, her snoring stable and rhythmic. But before Duncan could react to the situation, he noticed Shirley abruptly rousing from her slumber. Even Dog, who had been peacefully napping at the foot of the sofa, was propelled into the air due to the force of her sudden movement. Right, no. Shirley's attempted apology, "I'm sorry," didn't manage to leave her lips fully. Concurrently, a loud thud echoed through the room as Dog, who had been unexpectedly flung upwards, fell back to the floor. Then Dog rolled over, his head spinning from the abrupt upheaval. "What's happening? Are we under attack?" It was then that he registered the peculiar atmosphere surrounding them. Looking up, Dog noticed a number of strange glances being directed at himself and Shirley. "We're not under attack, Shirley just dozed off," Duncan clarified, a mixture of amusement and exasperation in his voice. He turned his attention to Shirley, who still seemed on edge. "Relax, you should head upstairs and get some proper sleep. It's important for youngsters to get adequate rest. Nina, you should also stop reading and head to bed." "All right." Only upon hearing this did Nina begrudgingly mark her place in the book. She was halfway through, got up, and clasped the still rigid Shirley's hand. Hand in hand, the pair retreated to the upper floor. As he watched the two girls ascend the staircase and disappear from sight, Duncan shifted his focus to Vanna, giving her a nod. "Tomorrow, you and Morris should head to the higher city district. Observe if there are any changes in the ambiance around the cathedral, and if possible, uncover City Hall's reaction. I'm curious why they are maintaining such a low profile despite the situation having escalated to this point." "Understood," Vanna responded, a nod of her own confirming her agreement. Then, her curiosity piqued, she asked, "What about you? What are your plans?" "I'm considering revisiting the second waterway with Alice," Duncan casually revealed. "We're planning to inspect the passageway where Crow encountered trouble. Given our current theory that a mirror frost exists and the possibility that the young lad mistakenly ventured there, we might be able to unearth some new evidence from that corridor." After uttering this, he suddenly realized, "Speaking of which, is Alice still busy in the kitchen?" "It appears so," Morris confirmed, standing up and pivoting. "She's been in there for quite a while. I hope she hasn't managed to get her head stuck somewhere and can't disentangle herself. She really knows how to create a predicament. I'll go check on her. Duncan sighed, a note of resignation in his voice as he rose from the sofa to make his way towards the kitchen. As he entered the kitchen, his eyes fell on the Gothic doll standing next to the sink. She hadn't entangled herself as Morris had speculated but was staring, at a rather odd angle, at a corner of the ceiling. Alice seemed so absorbed in her own world that she didn't hear Duncan's approach. She continued to blankly gaze in a direction where nothing appeared to exist. Then, she extended her arm, the one grasping a kitchen knife, and made swatting motions in the air. She then changed direction and continued her air swatting spree as if trying to catch an elusive, invisible fly. The sight of the Gothic doll standing in the middle of the kitchen, slicing through the air with a kitchen knife, her face devoid of any expression, was quite bizarre. Duncan couldn't help but humorously imagine a scene where a health bar appeared over the doll's head, accompanied by the typical organ-style soundtrack that plays during tense scenes in movies. "What are you doing?" he found himself compelled to ask. Alice jerked in surprise at Duncan's sudden question. Instinctively, she reached for her head for support but seemed to have forgotten that she was holding a sharp knife. In the following moment, there was a plop sound, and she had inadvertently stabbed herself in the forehead. Though Duncan was used to Alice's unpredictable and often startling behavior, this sudden development left him taken aback. He quickly moved forward to steady Alice's wobbling body, only to witness her flailing her arms in panic. She was still holding the kitchen knife, now with her own head skewered on its tip. After a moment of frantic flailing, she seemed to realize the predicament she was in. She quickly clutched her head with her left hand and yanked the kitchen knife out of her forehead with her right hand. Next, the doll fumbled to set the kitchen knife aside without realizing she had stabbed it into Duncan's arm before deftly reattaching the head to her neck. After a pop sound, everything seemed to return to normal. "You startled me." Alice spun her head to look at Duncan, a hint of accusation in her gaze. But soon her attention was diverted to something on Duncan's arm. "Captain, this knife looks familiar." Duncan, managing to keep his face impassive, or at least as impassive as one can be with a bandage covering their face, grasped the handle of the knife embedded in his arm when Alice stabbed him, casually withdrew it, and tossed it aside. "No surprise there, you just stabbed me with it when you set it down." "I'm sorry." The doll gasped, rushing forward to inspect his wound. "Are you all right? Do you need it bandaged?" "There's no need, I'm practically a corpse already." Duncan's mouth twitched in response, but his gaze involuntarily drifted towards Alice's forehead. The doll woman had just inflicted a large wound on her forehead, leaving an unsettling mark. However, at that very moment, the wound began healing astonishingly fast, almost visible to the naked eye. The wound didn't bleed, instead, it revealed a smooth and jade-like interior. Within a few short breaths, the surface was restored to its original flawless state. Feeling uncomfortable under Duncan's scrutinizing gaze, Alice instinctively touched her face. "Why are you staring at me? What are you constructed from?" Duncan questioned, his brows furrowed as he extended his hand to the spot where Alice had wounded herself. The texture was akin to human skin, albeit cold and devoid of life. "You had a gaping hole in your head a moment ago, were you aware?" Alice paused, her hand instinctively moving to touch her forehead, and responded in a somewhat bewildered tone, "It's healed." "Obviously, I'm aware it's healed. I don't understand." Alice shook her head. "I'm not certain of what material I'm composed of either. It doesn't seem to be wood or ceramics." Duncan held his tongue for a few seconds, then forced a smile. "I suppose I shouldn't have expected a comprehensive answer from you." "Forget it. What were you up to just now? Why were you fixated on the ceiling?" "There were lines," Alice stated candidly. "Some lines just manifested out of nowhere, but now they've vanished." At that, Duncan's expression shifted instantly. "Lines?" Alice was capable of seeing unique lines, and these lines represented people. "Yes," Alice affirmed with a serious nod. "I was perplexed as well about why the lines would suddenly materialize. There's no one else present here, but I remembered your instructions about not recklessly meddling with others' lines, so earlier I was trying to swat them away with the knife." Duncan barely registered the latter part of Alice's explanation. Instead, his mind was occupied with the lines Alice had mentioned, which had mysteriously appeared and then disappeared. His gaze rapidly swept the entire kitchen, looking for anything that might serve as a link to the mirror frost. The glass on the window, The water pooled in the sink, and even the blade of the kitchen knife could be used to connect with the other side. However, none of them exhibited any signs of abnormality. Regardless, Duncan trusted Alice, she had no reason to lie. At some point recently, there had been an overlap between the mirror frost and their reality. It might have been a fleeting, almost imperceptible intersection, but it was enough for Alice to discern the lines that had drifted over from the other side. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. The shift from serene weather to another round of snowfall was swift and sudden in the city-state of Frost. As the morning unfolded, ominous clouds hung heavily over the cityscape, resembling imposing blocks of lead. A wild and icy wind danced through the streets unrelentingly, seemingly setting the stage for what was to come. By the time the city clock chimed midday, the first snowflakes had already begun their descent from the heavens above. From the city's highest points to its lowest corridors, from the mightiest towers to the smallest alleyways, a thick blanket of snow had soon enveloped the entirety of Frost, presenting an enchanting spectacle. The sudden onset of snowfall had a dampening effect on the otherwise bustling streets of Frost. Most of its inhabitants hurriedly sought shelter indoors, rendering the city eerily quiet. Against this backdrop of tranquility, the shrill sound of a steam car's brakes felt conspicuously jarring. It was a stately gray vehicle that had pulled up in front of City Hall. As the car door swung open, Agatha stepped out dressed in her customary black attire. Her determined stride brought her directly to the formidable edifice that towered over the rest of the city. She looked up at the imposing structure, its architecture a vestige from the bygone era of monarchy, radiating the dignity and grandeur of yesteryears. Its majestic pillars, graceful arches, and intricate roof designs were a sight to behold at any hour. Even though its title had evolved from the old, Winter Court, to the present, City Hall, its significance within the city remained unwavering. City Hall, along with the silent cathedral, stood as a testament to the dual pillars of power in this icy landscape, sheltering the city and its precious mining ores. Just like a historical text etched in stone, this monumental structure held within its confines the ever-changing tale of power dynamics and significant personalities. Whether it was the age of queens, kings, or the contemporary system of administrative governance, each era found its place in the pages of this living history book. Agatha's brow furrowed as she reached up to gently massage her temple. She realized she had been lost in a world of contemplation once again, her mind wandering like a dreamy poet. This wasn't a one-off incident. Over the past few days, she had frequently found herself lost in thought or feeling an inexplicable restlessness. This was a worrying development. As a sentinel of the city-state, she needed to maintain a sharp, focused mind, free of daydreaming, a distraction that could not be afforded. Her introspection was interrupted by footsteps approaching from the city gates. A quick glance revealed a senior secretary, clad in a dark blue coat, walking towards her. "Miss Agatha," greeted the young man, who served as the assistant to the city administrator, as he bowed respectfully before her, "The governor has been informed of your arrival. He awaits your presence in the Dome office." A direct approach would be beneficial, Agatha conceded with a nod. "Proceed ahead." In a spacious office, topped with a round dome on the highest floor of City Hall, sat the incumbent governor of Frost, Winston, positioned behind an imposing curved desk. Winston was a burly man, carrying a bit more weight than necessary, cloaked in an extravagant bright blue coat embellished with medals and ribbons. Possibly, the demands of managing a declining city-state were overly taxing. His hair had diminished to an alarming extent, compelling him to resort to a curly wig to mask his bare scalp. As Agatha made her entry into the domed office, she noticed the governor absorbed in tweaking a small brass mechanical device placed on his desk. The intricate mechanical object resembled a miniature model of sorts. Its tightly interconnected gears and linkage structures were so delicately designed that they bordered on being art pieces. Under Winston's manipulations, the device intermittently emitted a clear, pleasing sound. "It's unexpected that you find moments to dabble with mechanical models amidst your pressing political responsibilities," Agatha's voice echoed from across the desk. "I was under the impression that the city-state's recent circumstances have been demanding all your attention. This isn't merely a model, but a prototype for the next generation mining car traction. It promises to conserve 30% of energy while offering enhanced reliability and durability than its predecessor." Governor Winston responded earnestly, looking up from his contraption, although we face mounting challenges in our city-state, it doesn't justify a halt in our progress and evolution. Agatha held her silence, not challenging his viewpoint. Governor Winston had always been deeply fascinated with mechanics and engineering. During his 12-year tenure as governor, he had channeled most of his energy into supporting and promoting engineering design firms as well as mechanical manufacturing factories. The ambitious governor seemingly aimed to address the city-state's ongoing crisis through technological innovations, including modernizing obsolete facilities and exploring new economic catalysts. However, to put it mildly, while his concept was commendable, his conviction high, and efforts abundant, the stark reality was an uphill struggle. Technological breakthroughs can facilitate renovations of mining facilities at a manageable expense. Practical, innovative machinery could also find potential markets in other city-states. Frost can't continue to rely solely on metal ore exports for survival. Winston, noticing Agatha's tepid response, felt compelled to elaborate further. The metal mines are indeed Frost's lifeline, but a pillar founded on a single industry is bound to be fragile. I am not a functionary in the domains of economics or technology, Agatha felt the need to gently remind him. Ah, of course, I seem to have overlooked that, Winston acknowledged, lifting his hand to set the mechanical model aside on his desk. He looked up at Agatha, shifting the conversation back to more pertinent matters. Let's proceed to the issue at hand then, Ms. Agatha. Regarding the exploration of the second waterway, I understand you have some concerns. The exploration team encountered an issue beneath the connection well in Central Zone 2, Agatha disclosed without beating around the bush. This corridor is situated near the base of the metal mine. Some sections of the pipeline branch exhibit signs of tampering, yet the entrance to the subsequent connection section is obstructed. I directed the exploration team to forcibly clear the obstacles in the second waterway. However, they reported finding a lead seal and a plaque left by City Hall affixed to the door. A lead seal and plaque from City Hall. A visibly surprised Winston attempted to mask his shock with a practiced look of astonishment. Are you certain about this? Agatha studied Winston's reaction closely. After a prolonged silence, she finally spoke in a low voice. It appears you were not privy to this. That's the second waterway, abandoned for over 50 years. Its last known usage dates back to the reign of the Frost Queen. Winston protested, throwing up his hands in an exaggerated gesture of disbelief. Even if there were to be any lead seal or plaque down there, it would certainly be remnants from the Queen's era. The idea of City Hall leaving anything behind is ludicrous. Are you insinuating that I covertly sealed that doorway? To what end? To hoard treasure deep underground? You indeed lack a logical motive, Agatha conceded with a soft nod. If you truly wished to conceal something of value, there are undoubtedly more secure locations within the city-state than the unpredictable second waterway. I'd rather not entertain such far-fetched speculations, Winston dismissed with a wave of his hand, his countenance turning noticeably serious. Was there no discernible date or name of the person responsible on the plaque? A standard plaque should bear such details. Identifying who locked the door should be quite straightforward based on this. Regrettably, all inscriptions are tarnished and hard to decipher. Both the plaque and the lead seal are substantially corroded. In fact, even the door itself is in a rather fragile state. We suspect the acidic environment within the strata near the mine has expedited the deterioration of the metal, Agatha relayed, shaking her head. All we can verify is that the door was indeed secured by City Hall. Lead seals of that specific design wouldn't have existed during the Queen's reign. A visibly irritated Winston rose from his seat, pacing anxiously behind the large, curved desk. After what seemed like an eternity, he halted his pacing and murmured, if it truly was the handiwork of City Hall, it must date back a considerable time, likely the first or second municipal government following the cessation of the Queen's reign. It appears as if your predecessors were not completely thorough in passing down all pertinent documents to their successors, Agatha remarked, a hint of dry humor in her tone. The early period of transition was marked by turmoil. It's likely that some documents were either lost or damaged in the process, Winston retorted with a dismissive wave of his hand. Nevertheless, the fact that there exists an area deep underground at the heart of the city, an area sealed off under the directive of City Hall and forming part of the second waterway, is quite irregular. This matter certainly warrants a comprehensive investigation, Ms. Agatha. Naturally, it's part of my duties, Agatha responded, her facial features softening somewhat. While I may not have procured the answer I sought, having your assurance of support is equally valuable. The exploration will proceed, and I aim to unveil what lies behind that door at the earliest. The Death Church will ensure City Hall is promptly notified of any developments. That's reassuring to hear, Winston nodded, the tension in the domed office easing ever so slightly. I shan't impose upon your time any further, Agatha declared. There are several aspects of the second waterway that require my personal attention. Having bid the governor a polite farewell, she turned and exited the domed office. Agatha's retreating figure vanished from the room, leaving only the gradually fading echoes of her cane tapping and heels clicking against the floor. After a significant pause, Winston let out a soft sigh, his brow furrowing in puzzlement. Ms. Agatha chose not to use Greywind for transportation today. The slightly overweight middle-aged governor glanced in the direction where Agatha had exited, murmuring to himself, it appears she can also walk in and out through the regular entrance, doesn't it? Buried deep within the clandestine tunnel linked to the second waterway, Nemo Wilkins held a lantern aloft, its feeble light casting an eerie glow on the surrounding damp stone walls. He navigated the twisting corridors with untroubled ease, his voice betraying a hint of mirth as he explained, our operatives have already been alerted. They've evacuated this area, ensuring they've left no evidence of our activities. Meanwhile, the church's forces are running themselves ragged, scouring the central city and the zones designated as X areas. The enveloping darkness should provide quite the challenge for them. I had half a mind to think you'd use this opportunity to sow a bit of chaos, Duncan remarked with an air of nonchalance, especially here in the second waterway, which I gather is essentially your stomping grounds. Such actions aren't in our nature, Nemo responded, shaking his head firmly. We owe our allegiance to Captain Tyrion, and he has never advocated for the demolition of this city-state. If anything, we see eye to eye with both the Death Church and City Hall in terms of preserving the city-state. As for the church's attempts to root out the cultists that infest this place, we certainly have no intention of aiding those cultists out of petty spite. Duncan nodded at this, accepting the rationale before posing another query, why hasn't Old Ghost made an appearance today? Old Ghost, well, Nemo's words faltered as a sigh slipped past his lips, his mental state has been deteriorating of late. Age is catching up to him, and the church's aggressive probe of the second waterway has unsettled him. The operation has stirred up memories of the skirmishes fought within these sewer tunnels in days long past. For his own sake, I had to insist that he lay low in the basement of the bar. Duncan could only express his sympathy with a somber sigh upon hearing of the lasting trauma endured by the last remaining soldier who had once pledged his loyalty to the Frost Queen. With Alice in tow, he followed Nemo further into the depths of the second waterway. They traversed the secret passage, passed through several camouflaged doors and seemingly guarded crossroads, and eventually gained access to the second waterway via an entirely different route than previously used. It was evident that in response to the exhaustive search operation initiated by the church and the city authorities, the covert operatives of the Mist Fleet ensconced within the city-state had sprung into action, deploying a set of prepared disguises and early warning systems. Ultimately, under Nemo's guidance, Duncan and Alice found themselves once again in the corridor where they had previously had their confrontation with Crow. I need to head back, Nemo declared to Duncan, the city's atmosphere is tense. There's been an uptick in activity above ground that needs my attention. I must warn you to remain vigilant of the churches. He intended to caution Duncan about the church's search teams prowling these tunnels, but he cut himself off mid-sentence, a sense of unease suddenly washing over him. After a moment's hesitation, he managed to voice his advice, try not to harm them. They're not malevolent individuals. A chuckle escaped Duncan's lips as he reassured Nemo, don't fret, I'm well aware of my limits. You should head back promptly, the bar has been devoid of its proprietor for an excessive amount of time. Understood. With that, Nemo made his departure, leaving the sprawling and chilly subterranean waterway plunged into a brief silence. Duncan's gaze swept up, lingering on the vacant passageway before him. His thoughts, however, were adrift in the memories of his prior visit to this eerie location. Not far from the foul sewage ditch that lay ahead was where the young man known as Crow had tragically met his end. He had expired on the parched soil, but the cause of his demise was suffocation by seawater. Intriguingly, within his pocket was found a scripture-like document, seemingly a transcription sourced from an unknown origin. By now, the corridor had been thoroughly cleaned, likely the handiwork of Nemo and Old Ghost. Duncan shifted his attention to Alice, who was trailing obediently alongside him. Despite the veil masking her features, her eyes were clearly visible, revealing a grave expression. However, He knew her mind was, in fact, blank, she was simply lost in thought, her mind unburdened by any specific concerns. Certainly, Duncan was aware that fruitful dialogue or logical reasoning were futile with this humanoid figure. Alice had been invited to accompany him solely due to her unique ability to perceive those elusive lines. Not even the sporadic leakages from the mirror world could evade her keen observation. If you catch sight of a line, inform me immediately, Duncan instructed, a note of gravity in his tone. Sure. Alice nodded without hesitation. Duncan began to tread forward, his pace measured, his thoughts still consumed by the unsolved mystery of Crow. Back then, he, Morris, and the others had theorized that Crow had unwittingly stumbled into a perilous area and met a disastrous fate. However, despite their meticulous search of the entire corridor, they had failed to unearth any discernible clues. The investigation had reached an impasse, but now, it seemed as though they might have stumbled upon a plausible explanation for the unknown location Crow had inadvertently strayed into. It was highly plausible that a fleeting intersection had materialized between the mirror frost and the real frost within this very corridor. It could have been a spatial rift or a momentary reflection materializing from a stagnant puddle. Poor Crow, who happened to be passing by, had unfortunately plunged into it. Regardless of the mechanism that facilitated his cross-dimensional transition at the time, one thing was apparent: this corridor likely constituted a vulnerable point of convergence between the mirror world and reality. The atmosphere underground was oppressively chilly and moist, with a persistent stench of decay and mildew tainting the air. It felt as though the entire city-state was a gradually decaying carcass, and they were navigating through its festering bowels. Footfalls echoed down the rancid sewer corridor, each sounding heavy and deliberate. Agatha proceeded slowly, utilizing temporary divination and spiritual sensing to determine her course while maintaining a vigilant eye for any stirrings in her surroundings. Her black garments bore the brunt of her numerous battles, heavily torn and frayed, exposing the soft inner armor and the ceremonial bandages encasing her body, which were now marred with splatters of blood. The injuries inflicted upon her had crossed the threshold of her body's natural healing capabilities. Nonetheless, there was a silver lining amidst this grim scenario. Agatha was growing increasingly confident that she was venturing in the correct direction. Following the defeat of numerous foe monsters and many clashes within this malevolent replicated city, she was finally picking up a stronger scent of the heretics. Guided by this olfactory clue, she wound her way through the labyrinthine streets and alleyways of the lower city, through the expansive and convoluted subway tunnel, into the collapsed and crumbling sewer system, and finally uncovered this realm that had been forsaken for an indeterminable number of years, buried deep within the bowels of the earth. The enormity of this place surpassed the details she had gleaned from the archive, and defied her imagination, which was shaped by the perusal of those documents. Agatha cast her gaze upwards, surveying the dimly illuminated wide corridor stretching out before her. Antiquated gas lamps were recessed into the walls flanking the passage. Their undersupplied flames flickered sporadically, their light dancing within the protective glass casings. The arched ceiling of the corridor showcased an intricate lattice of pipes and support structures. Under the unreliable gas light, everything cast undulating, warped shadows, as if a host of invisible entities were squirming in the semi-darkness. Running parallel to the corridor, filthy water coursed through the gutters, inducing a sense of nausea. The vile black water surged from grates embedded in the walls, merging into the ditches and producing a gushing sound. Agatha recognized her surroundings. This was the second waterway, snaking beneath frost, the site she had originally planned to guide her team to for exploration. The only divergence from her initial blueprint was that she had originally intended to explore the city-state's underbelly in the real world, whereas she found herself ensnared in a duplicate version of Frost. Agatha slightly shut her eyes, intently tuning into the movement of air around her. She shut out the pervasive, nauseating stench, depending on her spiritual intuition to hone in on the heretics' locations. She could sense that her connection with this artificial city was strengthening in proportion to the length of her stay and the frequency of her encounters with these aberrations. "It's ahead," she affirmed, her certainty resonating in her declaration. The gatekeeper abruptly snapped her eyes open, consciously neglecting the faint throbs of pain radiating from her wounds distributed across her body. She made a choice at the juncture ahead and carried on, plunging deeper into the passageway. A memory surfaced abruptly. In the not-too-distant past, she had an encounter with an entity that had descended upon Frost, potentially an ancient deity or a manifestation thereof. During their interaction, the entity had subtly insinuated to her to seek for hints underground. Presently, she was following the lead of the airflow, drawing ever closer to the lairs wherein these heretics had taken refuge. Indeed, these heretics were concealed beneath the city-state, ensconced in the forsaken second waterway. However, contrary to her initial suspicions, the underground refuge wasn't located in the real-world frost but in an extraneously replicated realm. A smirk tugged at the corner of Agatha's mouth. The path, despite its convolutions and diversions, eventually led back to the point of origin. She had misinterpreted the clue provided by the descended entity, falsely assuming that the enemy was in hiding within the second waterway in the real world. Now, having somewhat serendipitously infiltrated this replicated city-state, she stumbled upon clues within the second waterway of this facsimile. Could this turn of events be classified as a form of fortuity? Agatha was closely scrutinizing her environment. Although she hadn't conducted a comprehensive investigation of the second waterway in the real world, she was acquainted with its basic characteristics. She knew that the ancient sewer system had been entirely forsaken and sealed, with all the pipelines, vertical wells, and drains leading to the second waterway having been shut. In theory, it should be a parched or fairly dry area. However, in the sewer corridor stretching out before her, the sight of filthy water cascading everywhere was inescapable, and the sporadic sound of drainage echoed from the encompassing pipes. In this replicated frost, the second waterway seemed to be in continuous operation. Is this the disparity distinguishing a counterfeit from its genuine counterpart? Agatha mused when her train of thought was abruptly interrupted. A gooey, sickeningly squelching noise reverberated around her, and from the sewer outlets and the black pollution-encrusted surfaces of the walls, a ceaseless seepage of black muck was visible. The obstinate monstrosities had re-emerged. Her body was enervated, her wounds ached incessantly, the ritualistic bandages were torn, the benediction of the god of death was gradually dwindling, and the debilitating effects of blood loss had reached an unignorable threshold. Despite the adversities, Agatha merely lifted her head in composed defiance, eyeing the malformed creatures massing before her. Come forth then, I'll guide you to your demise. When the initial abomination bellowed its war cry and lunged menacingly in her direction, Agatha elegantly evaded its path, moving just a touch to the side. In the fleeting instant when her trajectory intersected with that of the beast, she gently brushed its body with her magical staff. This seemingly soft touch instigated rapid incineration, almost instantaneously reducing the creature to ashes. Before the pallid flames of the beast's demise could even touch the ground, Agatha skillfully redirected her staff, projecting an intense white line from the residual fire. This line descended upon the path ahead, expanding with a terrifying speed like a voracious wildfire, consuming the grotesque monsters in its path. Agatha deliberately minimized grand bodily movements, conserving her physical energy and reducing the strain on her body. She also made an effort to prevent direct physical contact with the beasts, aiming to decrease the psychological exhaustion such engagements could cause. The number of beasts that were yet to come was an unknown variable, making energy preservation paramount. Fear of death was a sentiment she did not share. She was well aware that even when her physical form ceased to exist, her spirit could continue to combat the enemy until her remains were naught but ashes. These ashes would drift throughout this damned land, perpetually purifying the repulsive creatures inhabiting it. She harbored no fear towards these eventualities, however, before she could embrace the sweet release of death, she had a mission to fulfill, uncovering the truth hidden within this chaos and preventing the heretics' actions as much as she could. As she journeyed onward, the frequency of attacks increased and the deformed beasts became notably agitated. This subtly reinforced her belief that she was headed in the correct direction, towards the heart of the heretics' den. More of the black, viscous substance began to ooze out from the surrounding walls and the imposing vaulted ceiling. Each crack, each crevice, provided an ideal breeding ground for these monstrous replicas. The environment had seemingly bred cunning into these creatures, making their behavior increasingly deceptive. A sinister hissing noise resonated from behind her. A surge of caution swept through Agatha's consciousness. Fatigue had started to cripple her reflexes, and she could only manage to barely twist her body in time to deflect the incoming attack with her staff. She felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, and amidst the shower of sparks from the center of her staff, a figure clad in black and wielding a similar staff was sent sprawling. This figure hit the ground, then awkwardly rose, moving with the repulsive grace of a soft-bodied creature. As it lifted its head beneath its black hat, a face that was slowly morphing and shifting was revealed. Amid the horror of this fluid countenance, some recognizable features began to form. The face abruptly ceased its movements, solidifying into a distinctive young man's visage. He raised his eyes to meet Agatha's, his expression one of confusion. "Captain, why are you here?" he inquired. The grip of Agatha's hand on her staff intensified until her knuckles turned an almost ghostly white, her penetrating gaze seemingly frozen in the horror of the moment. Simultaneously, an eerie voice began to resonate around her. The voice appeared to emanate from all directions, as if the labyrinthine sewer was the source. "Ah, you recognize him," the voice cooed, reverberating off the wet walls. "When you were not yet a gatekeeper, your loyal deputy captain shielded your escape from the abysmal darkness, you abandoned him there, why not take him back? How does that sound?" Agatha chose not to respond verbally. Her silence was her answer. She advanced stoically, taking 3 deliberate steps before morphing into a swirling gust of ashen wind. Her ephemeral form halted abruptly, solidifying before the young guardian. When she materialized again, her staff's metallic shaft was embedded deeply within the chest of the black-garbed pretender. Disbelief washed over the young guardian's face as he struggled to comprehend the lethal strike delivered by his once trusted captain. Then a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes as if he'd finally accepted the inevitable. With his strength waning, he whispered, "So, it's already over." "I'm sorry, it'll be over soon," Agatha murmured apologetically. A soft chuckle emanated from the dying guardian as his head dipped. "Captain, you've finally mastered the power of the gray wind." "Yes, it took a lot of practice," Agatha replied softly, her voice barely audible over the crescendo of pale flames flickering in her line of sight. The guardian's body was consumed by the fire, quickly disintegrating into a heap of dark ashes. Decisive, ruthless, qualities befitting a disciple of the god of death. The revolting voice echoed once more. As Agatha pivoted, she was greeted by a new wave of monstrous aberrations taking form. Imitations surged towards her from every direction. The puppeteer of the voice evidently had little regard for honor, commanding his minions to attack while simultaneously trying to manipulate her emotionally. The sound of exploding flames, the clashing of her staff against the monstrous bodies, and the whistle of the wind slicing through the confined space filled the underground corridor. As Agatha battled the onslaught of beasts, she called out defiantly, "These tricks serve only to stoke my fury, not to delay my progress. If anything, my anger will expedite my pursuit of your hideout. What do you stand to gain from this? Indeed, you are angry, and you seem more ferocious than before, but that's all right. A bit of emotional turmoil is necessary, Miss Gatekeeper." A sense of unease stirred within Agatha's heart as the voice faded into an ominous echo. What did he mean by a bit of emotional upheaval is necessary? But there was no one to respond to her questions. The master of the voice had a single objective: to exploit his minions to sap her strength and slow her pursuit. Now he had vanished, leaving behind another wave of monsters seeping menacingly from the dank walls. Agatha's gaze took on a resolute edge as she braced herself for the impending clash against her monstrous adversaries. Our warrior is embroiled in a skirmish with the enemy. An incandescent beam of green light suddenly pierced through the oppressive gloom of the second waterway. The fiery silhouette of a dove, named I, emerged from the blazing tongues of fire, making a graceful landing on Duncan's shoulder. With a flurry of wing beats, she began to squawk in a shrill, urgent tone. The unexpected arrival of the avian messenger, coupled with her piercing cries, took Duncan by surprise. His startled reaction almost resulted in a head-on collision with Alice. Having been meticulously combing the dry, sprawling underground corridor for half a day, Duncan widened his eyes in surprise and turned towards the flaming dove perched on his shoulder. "What's got you all flustered?" I cocked her head to the side, her small eyes boring into Duncan's as she nodded emphatically. "Our scout is under attack. Our scout is under attack. The battle is not tilting in our favor, our warrior is in combat with the enemy." Clutching her head, Alice said, "Captain, do you think I is having a case of indigestion?" In response, I swiveled her head to shoot a reproachful look at the doll, pecking her head twice and emitting a dong dong sound. Then, she resumed her squawking. "Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Does it make sense?" Alice let out a startled yelp, cradling her head in her hands as she scurried away from the relentless onslaught of the dove. Choosing to ignore the surrounding chaos, Duncan adopted a grave expression after processing I's incessant cries. He turned towards a particular direction, his gaze piercing the distance. "You two, quiet down," he commanded after a few moments of silence, directing a serious glance towards another entrance to the corridor. "I believe I might be onto something." Alice immediately fell silent, turning her gaze to match Duncan's. "It's the marker I left. It must be Gatekeeper Agatha." Duncan's voice echoed through the underground chamber as he began to move forward. "She's in the vicinity." Alice followed his gaze, and her eyes suddenly widened in recognition. "Oh, there's a line." Miss Dahl let out an excited exclamation and quickly darted past Duncan, moving at a speed that made her seem like a blur. Reminiscent of a child trying to catch a runaway balloon, she bolted towards a nearby intersection, jumping up to seize something seemingly invisible. All Duncan could see was Alice running ahead and then starting to leap in the air, reaching for something unseen. Then, he noticed her hand closing around something that had materialized out of thin air. He swiftly approached the spot, and Alice turned around to face him, her face beaming with a triumphant smile. "I caught it." Miss Dahl's radiant smile endured only for a fleeting moment. In the next instant, the ethereal line held delicately in her hands started to fracture and break apart, evaporating into the surrounding air as though subjected to a rapid process of decay. "Ah!" Alice cried out, the line broke. However, before she could even finish her exclamation, a towering figure swiftly approached from one side. Duncan extended his hand towards the disintegrating line, a fragment on the brink of complete dissipation dropped into his palm. Suddenly, a dim, green flame infused the fading line with a ghostly glow. Slowly turning his head, Duncan met Alice's eyes. Mirrored in Alice's wide-open eyes was the mesmerizing spectacle of a faint, green flame flickering with an eerie dance. "I've got it," Duncan murmured in a gentle tone. One grotesque creature was reduced to ashes in the cool glow of the ghostly flames, while another succumbed to a staff-induced blow that shattered its skull, causing it to collapse into a formless heap of mud. Agatha twisted her form in a fluid motion, her battle staff whirling through the air and arcing towards the last remaining enemy standing at the crossroads. However, her motion abruptly halted. Driven purely by instinct, without a second to ponder, an overwhelming wave of fear and shock consumed her completely. She could even feel her muscles and bones screaming in protest, forcing her staff to stop just millimeters shy of the head of the last counterfeit that had freshly emerged from the mire. Her eyes widened in anticipation as she observed the humanoid figure, molded from shifting mud, slowly raise its head. A pair of eyes slowly took form where the skull should be, and dim green flames sparked to life across its form. A deep voice reverberated from the dancing flames. "Agatha, do you require assistance?" Agatha reacted swiftly, retreating with her staff held high. Her eyes expanded with sudden alarm and caution, a stark response to the unfurling scenario before her. Her gaze was firmly locked on the deceitful creature, which was gradually lifting its head to confront her. Then, realization dawned on her. This entity, born of elemental mud, was undergoing a stark transformation. A mysterious power or perhaps an intention had taken hold of this creature, causing a rapid and radical change within its core. The creature had become something like a conduit, relentlessly radiating a menacing energy that filled the dank environment of the sewer with an unnerving air. A cacophonous eruption of sounds unfolded, transforming into a multitude of unintelligible whispers and roars that echoed within her consciousness. The edges of Agatha's vision became blurred, populated by trembling shadows within which countless eyes seemed to manifest. This was an unmistakable sign of a spiritual corruption taking root within her. The fatigue that had accumulated from successive battles and the toll it had taken on her spirit had weakened her resilience, rendering her almost defenseless against the oncoming assault. However, the contaminating influence subsided in less than 2 seconds, as if the power orchestrating the corruption had purposefully restrained it, reducing the overwhelming energy exuding from this avatar. As a result, Agatha's senses stabilized, regaining their clarity. In this fleeting moment of lucidity, she was able to discern the true identity of the entity before her. "You are the one who descended," she ventured hesitantly, massaging her aching forehead. "Yes, it's me," replied the avatar. Its form, composed of elemental mud, continued to writhe and shift, seemingly unable to contain such formidable power and struggling to maintain a coherent image. "Just call me Captain, my followers call me that." "Captain." Agatha's brow furrowed in confusion. Her thought processes were sluggish due to the lingering effects of her spiritual contamination. The moniker seemed odd, but she quickly brushed off her confusion. The world was filled with beings named Captain, and perhaps this high-level entity from an unknown origin had whimsically chosen to adopt the title. It was not a detail worth scrutinizing. "Why are you here?" she inquired, perplexed. "I've been searching for you for quite some time," replied Duncan. "You suddenly vanished in the city-state, and I assumed that something had happened to you." "You were searching for me." Agatha's surprise was palpable as she quickly surveyed her surroundings. "What is happening outside?" "If you are referring to the frost of the real world, then everything is proceeding as it should. It's so normal that it's suspicious." Duncan shrugged. "Do you have any idea where you are stuck?" I'm not sure," Agatha admitted, leaning against the wall and using her staff for support. She had been granted a brief period of safety and needed to seize this opportunity to regain her strength. This is another frost, a frost entirely under the control of counterfeits. There's no sun here, and my connection with the gods is weak. But I've sensed the presence of those annihilators. I've been following one of them until I ended up here." She momentarily stopped speaking, a slight gasp escaping her lips as she turned to address the being known as Captain. "A mirror," stated the temporal embodiment. "You are ensnared in a mirrored reflection of frost." "A mirror." A contemplative one quickly replaced Agatha's startled expression as she lowered her gaze. "I see, a mirror. They may have duplicated the entirety of frost, encompassing even the surrounding seas, and this mirror is the origin of all the counterfeits," Duncan elaborated. "What's more concerning, there are indications that this mirror and the actual world are steadily converging. This could possibly be the true scheme of the heretics." Agatha abruptly lifted her gaze. "You mean the frequent emergence of counterfeits in the city-state, the duplicate seagull, the disappearance of Dagger Island, even your current predicament, are all consequences of the mirror frost encroaching upon the real frost? The primary objective of the heretics was never to invade or annihilate the city, Agatha. They aimed to transform the entirety of the city into their version of reality. At some juncture, the continually approaching mirror and the reality are destined to collide." Agatha drew a slow, deliberate breath, murmuring to herself. She had already contemplated this possibility. No wonder the heretic mentioned that when the Guardians discover the sanctuary, it would signal the success of their plan. That moment refers to the point of contact between the mirror and reality. "It seems like you're piecing together the puzzle," Duncan observed. "You just alluded to finding traces of the heretics here. Are you trailing them?" "Yes, I've picked up on their trail. It leads further into this second waterway." Agatha lifted her gaze, peering deep into the shadowy corridor. After a brief rest, she regained some of her vigor and was standing upright once more, gradually advancing. "There's a heretic. He has been attempting to obstruct me, but his persistent presence only reveals more of his path. I feel that he's very close." The avatar manipulated by Duncan trailed behind Agatha. "I'm sorry," Agatha suddenly expressed, leading the way. "Why apologize? Just now, I almost attacked you." Agatha's tone held a tinge of embarrassment. Duncan was momentarily taken aback, then recalled the moment he initially took control of the avatar. Agatha's metallic staff was just millimeters away from his head. Upon reflection, however, he realized there was no need for concern. It was certainly a more favorable greeting than Vanna's abrupt jump chop. "I don't mind, I'm accustomed to it." "Accustomed to it?" "One of my followers has a tendency to react with a surprise jump chop when she's startled. Sometimes, I happen to be the target, although she has since ceased doing that." Agatha. The youthful gatekeeper was left profoundly startled, leading her to wonder about the type of interactions this ostensibly ancient entity had with his followers and the kinds of eccentric, bewildering, and peculiar characters his followers must be. She pondered for a moment, but her sanity was on the brink of exhaustion, and she was still unable to decipher the enigma. Duncan, however, was unperturbed by Agatha's sudden lapse into reflective silence. He simply continued his forward stride, scrutinizing the conditions in the corridor. This was the second waterway of mirror frost, strikingly different from its counterpart in the real world. He paused, gazing pensively at the sewer corridor extending into the murkiness ahead. "What's on your mind?" Agatha also halted, spinning around with a look of confusion to question him. "In the real world, this section is a collapsed area. The path is obstructed," Duncan uttered, his tone imbued with thoughtful consideration. "It appears that in this mirror frost, the second waterway is well preserved, even indicating signs of regular use. It could reflect the epic of the Frost Queen. Agatha's voice was hoarse. I've observed that many aspects of this mirror frost are familiar yet divergent, not reminiscent of the contemporary era. Duncan listened to Agatha's deductions in silence for a few moments. After a brief pause, he disrupted the quiet. It appears that I may not be able to accompany you for the rest of the journey. Agatha spun around in surprise. She watched as the avatar of the captain gradually began to disintegrate. The incessantly flowing and altering black mud seemed unable to contain the power surging. It was now slowly flaking off, leaving intricate patterns of intersecting cracks across its form. Green flames flickered amidst the lines, seemingly unable to be contained, spilling and flowing uncontrollably. She couldn't help but cry out, "Your body. Don't fret, this subpar replication is incapable of stably sustaining my power. Its collapse is an inevitable eventuality." Duncan merely shook his head, his tone calm. "I'm surprised I was able to persist long enough to convey this much." He then raised his hand, silencing Agatha, who was about to speak. "Your current condition is dire and in need of assistance. I will leave some residual embers here. They will amplify the connection between you and me. Take them, and continue your pursuit of the heretic's hideout. I will continue to aid you." Almost instinctively, Agatha stepped forward as if wanting to inquire further. However, before she could articulate her thoughts, the avatar, already teetering on the brink of collapse due to the immense power within, reached its breaking point. In a sudden eruption of emerald flames, the elemental mud forming the avatar ceased its flow, consumed by the inferno, and fragmented into numerous shards. Only a petite, finger-sized flame survived in the midst of the scorched black elemental remnants hovering just above the ground. Agatha found herself transfixed by the flame dancing just off the floor. Its eerie green hue instilled in the gatekeeper a sense of trepidation, prompting an instinctual fear and unease. Yet, after a moment's pause, she pushed past her apprehension and gingerly stepped forward, bending over slowly. "I hope this is the right choice," she murmured under her breath, and in her heart, she invoked the name of Bartok, then extended her hand towards the tiny flame, her action brimming with a newfound courage. The flame felt like an ethereal petal resting in her hand. "I can actually pick it up." Agatha found herself marveling at the flame she held in her hand. In that moment, she felt a bond forming between her and the flame. It was a subtle, bizarre, yet palpable connection. After a momentary daze, she snapped back to reality, cradling the gifted flame with utmost care. In her other hand, she grasped her battered staff and proceeded towards the darkest recesses of the second waterway.